There's a kind of fatigue that doesn't live in the muscles. It lives in the loop, that quiet, invisible chase for the next hit of proof. You know it. The rush when someone finally replies, the tiny surge when a number climbs, the soft crash after it fades. It's the exhaustion of being always slightly ahead of enough. You chase attention, deals, women, status, and somehow, with each win, feel smaller. Not because success is wrong, but because pursuit has replaced presence. The faster you move, the less of you is actually there. At some point, every man meets the split, the hunter, driven by scarcity, and the builder, who longs for stillness. The hunter says, "Keep running, or you'll disappear." The builder whispers, "Slow down, or you'll never arrive." That conflict isn't personal, it's archetypal. Modern life has built entire markets around your dopamine, reward on demand, attention on tap. They promise freedom, but sell dependence. And beneath it, something older moves, the king archetype, the part of you that builds order instead of chasing chaos. He knows restraint isn't weakness, it's power kept inside the walls. This is where the story lives tonight, between speed and gravity, between hunger and enough, between the boy who hunts to be seen and the man who builds so others can find their way. Before we go further, notice your breath. Is it shallow, like you're about to sprint, or deep, like you've already arrived? That's the nervous system's way of showing you which side you're living on. The next half hour isn't about giving up desire. It's about reclaiming authorship, building yourself until the things you once chased start finding you. So stay with this, not to add more noise, but to listen for what's beneath the hunt. Because sometimes the real chase isn't after people or goals, it's after the parts of yourself you left behind when you started running. There's a wound that hides behind ambition. It wears achievement like armor. It says, if I keep moving, no one will notice how afraid I am to stop. But the truth is quieter. The compulsion to chase often begins in boyhood, the moment you learned that stillness could make you invisible, that to be chosen, you had to perform, that to be safe, you had to prove. Jung called this a projection, the act of exiling a part of yourself and then hunting for it in others. You disown your own worth, then run after people or situations that seem to contain it. You chase power, peace, or beauty, not because they're out there, but because you've forgotten they were once yours. The pursuit becomes a mirror, but you mistake it for a map. Every victory taken from the outside leaks authority. You get what you want, but not who you are. The applause feels hollow because it never touches the original wound. Velocity without self-ownership is just refined dependence, dependence dressed in competence. You can look successful and still live like a beggar, waiting for something or someone to hand you back your reflection. Think of Tantalus, reaching for fruit that recoils each time he grasps it. The more he reaches, the farther it moves. That's the emotional architecture of chasing. Each attempt to secure worth externally makes it retreat further. The psyche learns, I must try harder next time. And so it builds a treadmill where your identity becomes cardio. In daily life, this shows up subtly. You reply faster, buy more, post louder, trying to keep the signal alive. Yet each action leaves you emptier, slightly more distant from the center you were trying to prove existed. The man who chases cannot rest, because rest feels like erasure. Here's the paradox. The more you chase, the more you confirm that you don't have. It isn't that desire is wrong. Desire is sacred energy. But pursuit without presence turns that energy into scarcity. It hollows you out. Take a breath right now. Notice if your chest rises high and quick or slow and heavy. That's the body telling the truth before the mind does. Most men live in the high breath, the body of the hunter, scanning, chasing, preparing. It's an ancient pattern that no longer fits modern reality. This moment, this awareness, is the first gate out of the mirage. You begin to see that the chase itself has been feeding on your attention, the very fuel needed to build instead. Every great transformation begins here, when the man finally stops running not because he's tired, but because he's ready to meet what he's been running from. And what happens next? The reason it's so hard to stop chasing isn't only psychological, it's biological. Your brain is built to reward uncertainty. The next chapter reveals how that chemistry makes the chase addictive. Uncertainty has a pulse. It feels like chemistry, like destiny, like the edge of something important. But most of the time, what we call chemistry, is just anxiety wearing perfume. The high that hits when someone almost chooses you, almost texts back, almost gives approval. That's not connection. That's a nervous system mistaking danger for desire. Many men live here, in the in-between. The heart becomes a slot machine. Pull the lever. Maybe you win. Maybe not. That maybe is what keeps you hooked. Behavioral psychology calls it variable ratio reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes casinos profitable. It's not the jackpot that traps you. It's the unpredictability, the almost, the next time, the phantom chance. Your body starts to believe that waiting, checking, refreshing is aliveness itself. The tension becomes the thrill. The problem isn't the people you chase or the platforms you use. It's that your nervous system has been trained to equate anxiety with meaning. So when calm arrives, you call it boredom and reach for chaos again. Dr. Gabor Mate often says that addiction isn't about pleasure, it's about pain relief. The chase isn't driven by greed, it's driven by escape. You're not seeking more pleasure, you're running from the silence that follows it. Every dopamine spike briefly lifts you above that silence, like a diver gasping for air between dives. But the relief never lasts. This is the invisible economy of modern life. Dopamine markets trade in uncertainty. The algorithm gives you one hit of validation for every 10 ignored posts. The relationship gives you one moment of closeness for every week of distance. You start living for the almost, because almost promises the high without the responsibility. Think of Vegas without neon. Your nervous system is the casino floor. Every vibration, every notification, every unread message is the sound of chips sliding across the table. You keep playing because you think the next hand will fix the emptiness left by the last. But the house always wins. And in this case, the house is your own limbic system, running on prediction error. When uncertainty becomes your drug, predictability feels unbearable. You call steady people boring. You call stability dead. But underneath that judgment is withdrawal. The body that lived on adrenaline now mistakes peace for danger. There's no shame in that recognition. It's biology, not character. Yet biology can be rewired. When you begin to meet the discomfort of stillness, to sit through the craving without acting, the nervous system starts to unlearn its addiction to maybe. You start to sense something stronger than the spike, your own presence returning. And that's the beginning of authority, because what you chase externally is often what you've refused to father internally. The next chapter steps into that territory, the part of you that keeps outsourcing your own power, and what happens when you finally bring it home. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from living under someone else's permission. You wait for the gatekeeper, the boss, the algorithm, the partner who never fully commits, to hand you a moment of approval. When it finally comes, it's small and fleeting, yet you treat it like oxygen. You build your rhythm around it, not realizing that your pulse is being set by someone else's hand. This is what Jung might have called an unfathered aspect of the psyche, potential without containment. A man may carry enormous capacity, but without inner authority, that energy leaks. The world keeps holding his mirror hostage. Every compliment, every like, every approving glance becomes a form of borrowed fathering. Neuroscience gives language to this cycle through something called dopamine reward prediction error. The brain doesn't release dopamine when it gets exactly what it expects. It spikes when the outcome is better than expected. The surprise, the maybe she's back, the it finally worked. That unpredictability creates intensity, and intensity masquerades as meaning. The stable, predictable result, ownership, peace, self-trust, feels dull by comparison. That's why boredom often follows breakthrough. You get the job, the partner, the attention, and suddenly it all feels flat. But that flatness isn't failure. It's the nervous system withdrawing from chaos. Boredom is the hangover after adrenaline leaves. In truth, it's a sign of healing. The craftsman myth captures this beautifully. A young man waits endlessly for his master's praise, not realizing that the master's silence was an invitation to self-verify. Every time you wait for someone else to crown you, you extend adolescence. Every time you create from your own standards, even quietly, you become father to your own work. Odysseus tied himself to the mast, not to prove strength, but to preserve direction. Discipline was his way of hearing the sirens without drowning. The same pattern lives in you. The discipline to stay the course, even when your instincts beg for distraction. Power, when fathered internally, stops depending on applause. It stops seeking reflection in others' eyes. The man who owns his rhythm no longer bargains with validation. He doesn't reject it. He simply no longer bleeds for it. Notice how much of your energy goes into performing worth rather than building it. Every performance is an invoice sent to the world for recognition. Every quiet act of creation without audience is wealth stored. That's the subtle shift, from performance to presence, from speed to gravity. Because once you stop chasing intensity and start building gravity, something else begins to move. You'll see that life doesn't respond to how fast you run, but to how deeply you root. And that's where we go next, into the architecture of gravity itself. Speed feels like progress, but it often hides fear. When a man has nothing to hold, moving fast makes sense. Momentum feels like meaning. But once you start building something real, integrity, a body of work, a life with weight, speed becomes sabotage. Nothing can land on a surface that won't stay still. In Jungian language, this is the tension between the king and the addict. The addict chases soothing. The king builds order. One seeks escape, the other holds structure. The addict spends his energy on intensity. The king invests it in boundaries. Both live inside you, but only one creates gravity, that subtle, invisible field that draws things toward you. Boundaries are often misunderstood as walls. They're not. They're magnets. A clear boundary defines where your energy begins and ends. It tells the world, this is what I can hold, and this is what I release. When you stop leaking through endless availability, attention naturally returns. Clarity attracts. Noise repels. Imagine a forge, the repeated rhythm of heat, hammer, and water. That cycle gives a blade its edge and the discipline that demands respect. The same principle shapes the psyche. Repetition, limit, recovery. That's how a nervous system becomes trustworthy. The man who keeps showing up for his rituals, his training, his craft, his prayer, becomes a field of predictability in a world of chaos. Others orbit not because he demands it, but because stability is rare. Dr. Gabor Mate often reminds us that healing is not the absence of pain, but the return of integrity. Gravity grows from that integrity. Every time you keep a small promise to yourself, you add a gram of density. Every time you betray one, you lose it. Most men underestimate how cumulative this field really is. Miss a day, lose a gram. Keep the line, gain a field. Over months, that invisible weight starts to shift everything. Relationships, money, direction. The world begins to respond differently, not out of mystery, but physics. In this stage, peace replaces the high of movement. It's quieter, but heavier in meaning. You no longer crave constant proof because the proof is built into your posture. Speed was once your drug. Gravity becomes your language. This is the point in every man's arc where life starts to approach him instead of running away. But the moment that happens, another temptation appears, to perform the newfound steadiness for applause. That's the next illusion. The next chapter meets it head-on. The move from performance to presence, from proving strength to embodying it. There's a moment in every man's growth when performance stops working. You've built the muscle, learned the language, achieved the competence, and yet beneath all that polish, something still feels hollow. It's the exhaustion that follows every display of strength meant to hide weakness. Performing competence is the mind's way of avoiding intimacy with its own inadequacy. You act certain because you're afraid of being seen uncertain. You keep proving power because you fear it isn't real. Jung would call this the shadow's disguise, the part of you that craves applause but distrusts it, the split between your public image and your private ache. Shadow integration isn't about defeating that part. It's about sitting with it long enough to understand what it's protecting. Often it's guarding a simple fear. If they knew I doubt myself, they'd leave. So you compensate with precision, control, or endless generosity. Anything to avoid being truly known. But the paradox is cruel. The more you perform, the less connection you feel. Real magnetism doesn't come from performance. It comes from cost. People sense what it took for you to become simple. The restraint, the repetition, the years spent sanding the edges of ego. A man who has faced himself radiates something still, almost unnoticeable, but impossible to fake. That stillness draws others because it signals safety. Here is someone who won't disappear under pressure. Think of the samurai entering a crowded room with the sword already sheathed. The proof of his power is the absence of performance. The blade is there, but peace holds it steady. That's quiet flex, not repression, not showmanship, but authority so integrated, it no longer needs an audience. Dr. Mate often notes that healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about reclaiming the parts you abandoned to survive. When you integrate your shadow, applause loses its grip. You stop needing to be impressive because you've become trustworthy, first to yourself, then to others. In daily life, this looks like doing your work without announcing it, showing care without rescuing, walking away without grand speeches. It's the maturity that replaces the flair of performance with the gravity of presence. When you stop signaling hunger, the ecosystem around you quietly reprices you, not because you've manipulated perception, but because you've changed frequency. Energy leaks stop. Attention returns. The world senses coherence. And when that happens, something deeper awakens. The impulse to choose not from fear or image, but from alignment. That turn, from chasing to choosing, is where the story culminates next. There's a quiet fear that hides beneath ambition, the fear of being chosen by something real. Because the moment you commit, every other option dies. That finality feels like loss. So you keep the doors open. You call it freedom, but it's really avoidance. This is the final illusion of the chaser, confusing open options with power. In truth, it's dilution. When everything is possible, nothing is meaningful. You stay in motion not because you're clear, but because clarity would demand a stand. Fear of loss often disguises itself as high standards. You tell yourself you're just being selective, that the timing isn't right, that the next version of you will be ready. But underneath those justifications lies a deeper truth. You're not avoiding failure, you're avoiding transformation. Because once something chooses you back, the game of pursuit ends, and you have to live what you've built. Commitment, in Jungian terms, is a selection pressure. It refines. It burns away what isn't aligned. The psyche can only integrate what it's willing to stay with. When you narrow focus, the value density rises. What remains after the contraction is what's real. That's not scarcity, it's filtration. Think of it like light. A bulb spreads in every direction, diffused, harmless. A laser narrows to one beam, coherent, potent, cutting through distance. The same principle applies to the soul. When your attention stops scattering, when your choices align around one direction, you stop chasing light and become the source of it. Renunciation isn't deprivation, it's a declaration. I trust that what's meant to meet me will recognize the signal of who I've become. That signal can't broadcast through static, through endless scrolling, second-guessing, half-hearted pursuits. It requires a fixed beam. The lighthouse doesn't move, the world does. The beam stays steady, and the ships find their way because of it. That's what true authority feels like. Not dominance, but constancy. You don't need to search for opportunities, validation, or love. You hold the beam, and what's aligned begins to navigate toward you. Here's where many men lose their center. The ocean tests the resolve. Storms come, doubt whispers. The old urge to chase returns, but hold the beam. Every moment you do, reality starts to reorganize around your gravity. The chase ends not in triumph, but in peace. The quiet knowing that you no longer need to be everywhere, because what's meant for you now knows where to find you. And when that peace finally settles, the man who once hunted for meaning becomes the man meaning hunts for. When you look back on the chase, it begins to make sense. It was never about ambition or conquest. It was a symptom, projection feeding on uncertainty, reinforced by the body's chemistry and the mind's loneliness. Each pursuit was a mirror, showing you the part of yourself you'd left in exile. Jung once wrote that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That's what this journey has been, turning toward the hidden drives that shaped your seeking. You weren't broken, you were just unclaimed. Every projection, every compulsive reach, every dopamine spike was your psyche's attempt to find its missing center. Building yourself is how you remove the splinter, not how you polish the pain. The man who builds stops trying to be rescued. He stops trading speed for gravity. He learns that restraint isn't suppression, it's power contained. The shadow that once ruled him becomes raw material for authority. The same hunger that once scattered him now fuels depth. Transformation isn't loud. It happens in posture, in the way silence stops feeling like threat and starts feeling like home. The nervous system steadies, boundaries grow roots, rituals anchor meaning into the ordinary. Over time, the velocity junkie becomes the man of gravity, sovereign, not superior, present, not performative. And from that center, life begins to reorganize. Work, women, and opportunity stop being prey you chase across the horizon. They start orbiting the field you've forged through patience and consistency. Not because you've mastered attraction, but because you've become congruent. The lesson beneath all this could be said simply, become a well, not a hose. Pressure comes to what holds water. Let that image settle. The well doesn't move. It deepens. It receives. It stores. It feeds without depletion because it knows its limits. That's what the whole journey was pointing to. From the mirage to the forge, from performance to presence, from chasing to choosing. The man who learns to hold himself no longer hunts meaning in others. He embodies it, and everything that once ran from him now comes home.